This is the second course of our digital forensics lecture. Previously, we have made an introduction to data forensics. Now we will try to explain the computer systems and required equipment for forensics examiners. And then after we finish this one, we will go on with file system fundamentals. What we will do in Computer Systems for Forensics Examiners course in this lecture is as following. We will first define the hardware devices, how we can use them. The examples are write blockers, logging systems, disk access tools, and wiretappers. And then we will discuss the software devices, like disk cloning, memory cloning tools, disk wiping tools, metadata extractor tools, and search tools. And we will make a follow-up with some examples and some operating systems that you can specifically use for digital forensics. Let's start with hardware devices. The hardware devices are the devices that has physical existence, and these devices could be used to support your forensics examination. Also, some of them are some hardware tools that you can use to put in between your evidence and your network or your computer. So actually you can ensure that you are not disturbing or manipulating the evidence by making any kind of software mistake. This is a very common problem, that you may always choose to use software tools instead of hardware devices, but most of the time the software tools have some kind of configuration to adapt different scenarios and to communicate with different devices and so on. As a result, if you misconfigured in the beginning, you may actually have a chance to modify the evidence, which actually renders the evidence as not evidence. So most of the time the hardware devices are used as a safeguard, something like fuses in electrical systems, to ensure that even if by mistake, no one could actually modify the evidence. As I explained this like that, one may think the first example, the write blockers are the blockers. These devices are used when you want to read something from a disk drive. For example, you have a disk drive, you isolate it from the computer system, and you want to read what is inside that disk drive. Most of the time, what you could do at home is simply plugging that hard disk on a computer, on another computer, to read the contents. But even in that case, there may be subtle changes on the hard disk. For example, the operating system may actually append just a timestamp to indicate that the disk is actually turned on and start working, or the last access date of system files could be affected. To stop that, instead of connecting the device directly to your computer, most of the time you have a write blocker, and this write blocker is actually looks like just a cable that you put in between your computer and the disk drive. And in this write blocker, the cables you use for writing to the disk are actually cut off. So even if you try even if you do any mistake, there is no chance that you can write on the disk. This is very beneficial, and this is very important to collect evidence. If you use a write blocker, a hardware write blocker, you are sure that nothing have been modified during reading or copying the disk. You may think, as an example, you may think that even you can try to have a copy of a file for yourself. You can copy one file from one folder to another folder. It is a very easy copy operation. But even in that case, you may observe that the last access date of the file has been changed. So this is the metadata that is kept in the file system. And if this metadata is changed, it may be lead to another kind of reasoning during a case in a court. So you may think that this file has been accessed yesterday instead of 3 years before. So it may lead to another conclusion. So you don't want to do that. That's why a write blocker is very important, and these devices should be used during copying. Of course, there are write blockers that are software-based, but you need to put your utmost awareness whenever you are making this configuration, because one mistake could modify the evidence and there is no returning back. The second thing I will mention about hardware devices is logging systems. Some of the, as I have mentioned in the previous lecture, I can say that there are some logging systems that are outside the computer system. The logging system could be another computer, and every action that is made on one computer could be sent to the other computer over the network, or they may be simply storage devices, but write-once storage devices. These are sometimes called WORM, as a shorthand for write-once, read-many. These devices could sometimes called WORM storage devices. You may simply think of a CD drive, for example. If you write all actions on a CD drive, actually there is no way that you can erase that if it is not a rewritable CD drive. Therefore, you end up with a indestructible physical copy of the actions that is done on the computer system. Maybe another way, which is very easier to visualize, is to printing everything out. Whenever something happened in a computer system, some action happened, you have a specific printer that is spared just for this job, and it continuously print whatever is made on the computer. And if you have the copies of this printed papers, actually you don't have any method to delete those things. You cannot just rewind and overwrite those printed pages. So actually this is a logging system that you may want to use when using your forensics. And this kind of logging systems are actually very capable of building evidences that has integrity. Another system could be disk access tools. Such tools are used to connect collected disks, collected, isolated, separated disks to the examiner's computer. These disk access tools sometimes have write blockers on them, or sometimes they are just used to build some communication in between the computer and a bunch of disks. And just for practicality, you may see some devices that can support 5-10 disks at the same time, and you can communicate with all the disks at once. these systems sometimes can copy one disk to another disk without without necessitating a computer. So you can actually make simple copies of disks during evidence collection. You may think in a raid to a criminal crime scene. You may want to copy the disks and then leave them as they are, so you can store the computers in some area, but you would like to have copies of the storage to investigate further. So you can just take the hard disks out, clone them from one disk to the empty disks you have, bring together with yourself, and then you can actually pack and keep the computers in a safe place. Another thing we may think of, another hardware device is wiretappers. These devices are used to listen to communications in computer networks. You may simply think that a router or a switch device could act as a wiretapper, but there are some designated hardware devices to do that. And of course, there are some devices that can listen the radio, devices like Wi-Fi devices or Bluetooth devices. So in general, we all call them wiretappers, but these are actually sniffers that can collect information from computer networks in different levels. These may be very low level, or they may try to run some kind of network protocol like IP or TCP and end up with the package contents instead of the raw packages. These are all possibilities, and there are devices that can do that, that can do such, that can realize such functionality in wired or wireless computer networks. And just to be sure that you are not actually modifying the contents of the network, you can use such passive sniffer devices, which are sniffer hardware, to collect information from a computer network. Then I can say we have a software version of all of these things. For example, for a wiretapper, many people heard about PCAP or Wireshark software, so you can collect the network traffic on an endpoint and interpret the results after that. You can have software logging systems, you can have software write blockers, and you can have software that can manage your disk access and so on, or that can make copies of disks. But some other devices could be useful. Some software tools are useful, and most of the time we don't have any hardware version of those. What we have is memory cloning tools. Memory cloning could be very important because when you turn off the computer, the memory is erased at all, and there is no coming back. So if you are trying to investigate on a live system, you may want to have a dump of the memory, and you may want to store it. So there are tools that can do that for you. These are software tools, mostly integrated with the operating systems, or even if they are separate, they make calls to the operating system of the computer, so you can have an exact copy of the computer's memory to be investigated further. Of course, you can have these cloning tools, and these are, again, could be built into operating system, or you can have separate software tools for this cloning, or disk management. These are all make requests to operating system and work together with the operating system to do these tasks. Disk wiping could be very important and beneficial. One of the most obvious uses of disk wiping is to fill the contents of the disk with all zeros or with random bits. This is very important because actually if you have a brand new disk and you want to make a copy of a disk that is examined currently, you would like to be sure that the disk you have doesn't have anything in it, because imagine you are copying from Alice's disk to Bob's disk, and then you investigate further on the copied image of Alice's disk, but you don't realize that Bob also has some content in it and there may be remains of that. Actually, what we do in forensics is we are always looking for remains, and if there exist any prior remains in one of the disks, you cannot use it to collect evidence. Therefore, the initial thing most of the time you do is to wiping a disk clean, and wiping means you either fill it with all zeros or you either fill it with just random bits, and then you start your investigation on this disk. So having the disk, the target disk to be examined is not valuable by itself. You need to make a copy of it on a clean disk, and you should do your modifications or further research on the copied version and keep the original version safe in some place. Another thing, another software tool could be metadata extractors. The metadata extractors are useful to extract information about a file or a system. Most of the time, when you think about a file, you only think about its contents, but actually it includes many other details, and these details may or may not be included within the file itself. For example, the last access date, the creation date, or the authorization settings, like the permissions, if some user could read it or not. These metadata could be helpful, and in some file versions, these kind of things could be inside the file itself, or most of the time, these are just put into the file system and managed by the operating system. So you need to have some kind of software tool to communicate with the operating system, collect all these metadata, report and interpret it. And finally, you may remember that I have mentioned about empty spaces of the disks, and these empty spaces could include some remains of previously stored data on the disk. Even if they are deleted, some parts of that file or that data could be placed, could be still residing in empty spaces of the disk. So to understand if there is some kind of pattern or a piece of file existing in that empty space, we need to do some search on this space. But this search will not be very similar to searching for a word in a word editor, in a text editor, but it will be something more like looking for bit patterns in the very physical raw contents of the device. So you need to have some kind of raw level access to disk, and you need to have fast, efficient ways of, performant ways of making these searches. These devices, these tools, these binary search tools, could help you to search for some specific text, some specific piece of file, or maybe they may even find pieces of specific file types for you based on previously known signatures of those kind of files. This the lecture for computer systems for forensic examiners. Uh, Everyone should have some kind of tool set to use with the computer systems for digital forensics. There may be specific platforms, software, or operating systems to be used in forensics. One of the very famous one is Kali Linux, which has also used in computer network security, and it also includes forensics tools within itself, and it also has a non-disk modifying boot option that you can boot Kali Linux in forensics investigation mode, and then you can continue without modifying the computer system and just observe and read the contents of the disks and the computer system. So these are the tools that we will mention in this lecture. In the next lecture, we will focus more on file systems. Goodbye.